Okay, welcome back. We are now in part two of the IBio SL um, D.6 gas exchange. Okay, we just talked about oxygen dissociation curves, lung tissue, and CO2 transport. So if you missed any of those, go ahead and head to part one. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about blood pH. So, the interesting thing off the bat about blood pH is that not only does the blood become more acidic because of carbon dioxide, like we talked about in the last video, but also that there are chemoreceptors in your body that are sensitive enough to changes in the blood pH to trigger body responses in order to maintain that balance, in order to maintain homeostasis. Okay. So the lungs regulate it by amount of ventilation. So if you've got too much carbon dioxide in your blood, they breathe faster or heavier. And kidneys also control reabsorption of the bicarbonate ions that we saw last time um, from the filtrate and clear any excess in the urine. So we actually see this on both sides, okay, lungs and kidneys. Now it is regulated to stay within the range of 7.35 to 7.45. Okay, so human blood can only, for us to like maintain everything being okay, we really have a very narrow tolerance range, 0.1 pH. Okay, so it says in part, but it really is very heavily maintained by plasma proteins acting as buffers to make sure that our blood does not too rapidly change in its acidity, in its pH. Okay. And this is essentially how, if pH rises, so this is our normal amino acid. Okay. Our normal amino acid, if pH rises, then uh, hydrogens start dissociating. Okay. So in an alkaline medium, if our blood becomes very basic, okay, or too basic, if the pH rises, the hydrogen on this carboxyl group will actually dissociate and to keep pH from changing too heavily. If the pH falls, then a hydrogen will actually come in and latch onto this amine group over here, and both options create these amino acid ions, but it does overall keep the blood from becoming too acidic or too basic. Okay, so this is the basics of that idea. Okay, so next we're going to talk about Bohr shift, and this goes along with our oxygen dissociation curves. So, um, the dissociation curve we already talked about, but what's interesting to note and what's really important is that blood pH actually can affect how that curve looks or how hemoglobin operates. So carbon dioxide lowers the pH of the blood. That causes hemoglobin to release its oxygen. In a more acidic environment, hemoglobin releases its oxygen. This is known as the Bohr effect, and you will absolutely need to know that. Okay? This decrease in pH shifting the oxygen dissociation curve to the right. Now, cells with increased metabolism release greater amounts of carbon dioxide, hence hemoglobin is promoted to release its oxygen at regions of greatest need. Meaning, if we look here at our Bohr shift diagram, so this purple line in the middle is our original oxygen dissociation curve. And if you remember from the last video, we talked about how up here, it's essentially, this is usually going to be at the lungs. So this is going to be where our little hemoglobin Ubers are picking up their passengers and taking them off to the tissues, to their little homes, until finally emptying out and having to go back. So if carbon dioxide goes down, if pH goes up, so if the blood becomes more alkaline, more basic, okay, so if there's not as much carbon dioxide, hemoglobin will actually hold on to its oxygen a little bit longer. And you got to think about why this might be. If you don't need as much oxygen in these areas, if our carbon dioxide levels are low, hemoglobin doesn't need to give as much oxygen away, so it holds on to it a little bit longer, so that it can actually help to balance that out a little bit. Whereas if the blood pH is low, so if carbon dioxide levels are high, hemoglobin will actually let go of its oxygen a little quicker. This allows for the tissues to get oxygen a little bit easier and for hemoglobin to pick up carbon dioxide a little bit easier as well. Okay, so keep in mind about what this means. Hemoglobin, and this isn't. You got to keep in mind again, hemoglobin is just a protein. This is not an organism. This is not like a thinking, living thing. Just the way that this protein happens to be, quote unquote, designed is that it naturally holds on to its oxygen if it needs to, and it naturally lets go of its oxygen if it needs to. So this is pretty interesting. This is our Bohr shift, okay? Higher pH holds on to its oxygen. Lower pH lets go of its oxygen. This is to offset the carbon dioxide levels in either case. Okay, next we're going to shift to respiratory control. Okay, so respiratory control. Now we talked a little bit about this already in our other lungs section in my class, but let's go ahead and go through it. So the respiratory control center in the medulla oblongata responds to stimuli from the chemoreceptors in order to control ventilation. So the medulla in our brain is important for a number of reasons, primarily because of what we've already talked about with the heart and its control of the heart, and the medulla oblongata with the control of ventilation. Now, if you'll think about it, okay, both of these things are going to be sending these hormones in response to increased CO2 levels and or increased levels of, or rather decreased levels of oxygen, which, if you think about it, really just goes along with the idea that the brain is able to respond in two separate ways, both increase in heart rate and ventilation rate in response to CO2 levels being high. I wiggle, sorry. Okay. So yeah, as it says right there, during exercise, metabolism is increased, build up carbon dioxide. So here's what you need to see, okay? So as carbon dioxide levels get high, chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata, as well chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata send a signal to the brainstem, which then goes to the muscles of breathing, and you get ventilation, okay? Oxygen and blood pH, those are taken up by peripheral chemoreceptors. This is in the carotid or the aortic arch. Okay, this is in actual blood vessels that have pockets of nerves, which again sends it up to the brain stem, which then controls your muscles of breathing, which causes alveolar respiration or ventilation, breathing. Okay, that might seem like a lot. Basic idea, all you really need to know is that both your brain and a little bit of your blood vessels are partially in control of how you are breathing or how quickly you're breathing in response to oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. Okay. Now this is a specific application of all this idea of high altitude training. So we need to talk about this application of the consequences of high altitude for gas exchange. At high altitude, pressure is a lot lower. Okay, the overall air pressure is going to be a lot lower. So there's a lower partial pressure of oxygen. This makes it more difficult for hemoglobin to take up and transport oxygen. So respiring tissue will receive less, leading to symptoms such as fatigue, headaches, and rapid pulse if you are not from those areas. But over time, the body may begin to acclimatize or acclimate to the lower oxygen levels. So red blood cells, we get more red blood cells. They have a higher hemoglobin count, which is key because more hemoglobin you have, the more oxygen they can pick up, and they may actually have a higher affinity for oxygen in the first place. Okay, you will actually be able to breathe more. Vital capacity increases to improve rate of gas exchange. Muscles produce more myoglobin. Lots of things start happening in order to make it easier for your body to deal with the low amounts of oxygen in the air. And here's a great representation of what this looks like. At sea level, because of gravity and a number of other things, we've got a lot more concentration of just air particles in general, including oxygen. As you get higher up into the atmosphere, you're going to see a lower amount of those particles, a lower amount of that gas, because it just isn't being pulled down as much. So it takes a lot more energy to stay up that high. So you can see that here. So athletes, a lot of you have actually probably heard of this before, but athletes will often go to very high altitude places. So a lot of times, like swimmers, like Michael Phelps, or runners in particular. I think I actually read about Usain Bolt doing something like this. They will go to a high altitude area like Colorado, and they will train there in order to boost their ability to do gas exchange, so that when they go to compete at a lower altitude area, it's much easier for them with all of that extra oxygen, quote unquote extra oxygen now, much easier for them to take that oxygen into their lungs, into their tissues, and have more of it to do more respiration, which allows for more work. You see where I'm going. ATP, blah, blah, blah. We've talked about it a bajillion times. Okay? Now, emphysema we already talked about, so we don't need to go too much into it. But the reason that this is in gas exchange is because, as you see here, normal alveolus looks like this. Normal alveoli looks like this. It's got lots of little compartments. This makes sure that the partial pressure in each of them is relatively consistent. Emphysema causes these big holes and these big open spaces in the alveoli, and that can be difficult for gas exchange because you can't get as much. I mean, think about it. If you've got gas exchange happening here, any air, any oxygen that's going to be in this area, it's not going to get anywhere. It's not going to be able to do the gas exchange. Whereas in here, you've got gas exchange happening around the walls of each and every one of them. It's going to be much more efficient. So this is the issue with emphysema. Now, the extra content, again, lung cancer we've already spoken about, so don't really think we need to talk much about that. Okay, just remember the common risk factors. Radiation is one. Unlikely that you're going to be getting that much. Aging, this everybody ages. Keep in mind that these are risk factors. It does not mean these cause a lung cancer. Okay, keep that in mind. This is just as you've been exposed to these things, or as you get older, you are more likely to develop lung cancer. Pollution, smog, environment. If you live in an area with apparently a lot of radon gas, please don't. If you've got different diseases, like if you are already suffering from COPD, then you're more likely to get lung cancer. Genetics, if your mom had cancer, lung cancer, you are more likely to. Occupation, if you're taking in a lot of smoke or pollutants into your lungs, more likely. Asbestos, and other silicates, not as much of an issue in the U.S. anymore because it's kind of been taken care of, but in many ways and in many places, but it's going to definitely be an issue in other parts of the world. And then tobacco, as well as just any kind of smoke, specifically secondhand smoking. So if you or anybody you know is a smoker, you may want to make sure that everybody is aware of their possibility of developing lung cancer. Okay, and then asthma. Asthma. All that asthma actually is the constricting of airways because of inflammation in the tissues there. And this happens for a number of reasons: allergens, smoke or scented products, stress, anxiety, food preservatives. Okay, it's really common chronic inflammation of the lungs. Nothing crazy about it. Okay, I'll let you remember that mnemonic right there. But that's all I have for you guys for gas exchange. So, if you have any questions, again, remember you can DM me, you can email me, you can hit me up on Classroom if you need to. But otherwise, I'll see you next time. Stay good. Gucci.